One.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining us again in another Wednesday of discussion. Sorry, Tuesday of discussions of Ayn Rand's essays. Today we will be discussing Faith and Force, the destroyers of the modern world. If you can see behind me, I have two different pictures. One of them, it's about an Enlightenment experiment, and the other one, which I think you won't be able to see, it's the death of Socrates. I didn't put them there by mistake. I think they represent today's topic. To discuss this, we have James Valliant, as always, the author of Creating Christ and The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics. If you are interested in this topic, please consider subscribing to the Ayn Rand Center UK. But more importantly, please interact with us through super chat questions if you're watching it live through YouTube. Okay, James. So my first question is if you could talk a bit about the context of the essay, because I think this is one of the earliest essays that Ayn Rand publishes, maybe even earlier than For the New Intellectual, which is one of her firsts.
This was a speech that she gave, really started giving at universities only a couple of years after the publication of Atlas Shrugged. Atlas Shrugged came out at the end of 1957, and it is here in 1960, throughout the course of 1960, that she's lecturing at Columbia, Yale Law School, Brooklyn College, and really leading universities on the East Coast. The first time she came out after Atlas Shrugged, really for the first time here, she came out with a public speech. This was long before the Ford Hall Forum speeches. The Objectivist newsletter didn't even begin publication, I believe, until January of '62. Now, this was a very exciting time for Ayn Rand in 1960. It is by the end of 1960 that she's completed For the New Intellectual, and it'll come out the following year. It is in 1961 that she gives The Objectivist Ethics, her extended essay on the foundations of objectivist morality, in a symposium at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So it's in 1961, 1962 that she's doing her very first publicly, published nonfiction work since the 1940s. She felt she needed to get out there and explain the ideas in her novel Atlas Shrugged, which was still continuing to be on bestseller lists even years after its original publication. But this was before the Objectivist newsletter, before any of that, and during a very exciting time where she's writing some of her most foundational and important essays. 61, the Objectivist Ethics, which would later appear in The Virtue of Selfishness, For the New Intellectual, which would later appear shortly thereafter in a book For the New Intellectual, and here, Faith and Force, really her first public speech after Atlas Shrugged.
I think we will talk a bit later about the bankruptcy of today's culture, but do you think that there is some different tone in this essay, different from what she publishes later? Like I think and I feel that it's something of the nature of the whole intellectual culture is bankrupt and it is for us to take. And I think even though she remained having that kind of speech, I think she was more certain that was going to be the case. Do you agree with this assessment that I'm making?
I do believe that the central focus of the speech here is to the importance of philosophy. Without understanding the bankruptcy of philosophical ideas had kind of reached its nadir in the middle of the 20th century. And Ayn Rand was trying to stress very much that philosophical bankruptcy and the cultural bankruptcy that necessarily leads to actually obscures the relationship between faith and force. What she really thought was at the root of contemporary problems. And that kind of intellectual bankruptcy, she was fully convinced of then. And I think that her ideas actually only gained flesh as time wore on. She was a prophet. She actually predicted, in effect, things getting worse, and things did get worse in some ways. Now, here she is explaining her philosophy in a general sense. She's trying to sell philosophy in general, and her philosophy in Atlas Shrugged in particular. In particular, her critique of altruism, as we'll get to. But yeah, the tone is a little different because she is, as her writings do increase, she is at least increasing in her confidence that there's an alternative and that she is providing that alternative to the culture.
Thank you. So, what is the main thing that Rand is trying to explain in this essay? And since you already touched about that, could you give us an introduction on the kind of culture that she's trying to explain and that she's trying to speak about?
Well, she realized, as she points out, it's not the sense that people can't find answers, because both at the time she was writing in 1960, there was sort of a crisis in confidence that was occurring for both left and the right in an intellectual sense. The 1940s proved a crisis for collectivism. Socialists like George Orwell were being as critical of Stalin, the communist, as much as Hitler, the Nazi. As we said in one of our previous discussions, there were leading communist intellectuals, leading Trotskyites, who were abandoning not only communism and socialism, but moving to the political right. Men like James Burnham, the philosopher, and Max Eastman, the leading radical. You have, in this period, a crisis for the far left. British socialism was failing. Communism was slaughtering tens of millions of people still across the globe. And so there was a sort of intellectual crisis of confidence that was occurring at this time. This did not stop the crusading nature of the collectivists, just to take one example, but it did indicate that they were facing the postmodern crisis of knowledge and certainty. And so relativism, skepticism, nominalism, pragmatism, had Kantianism in general. The philosophy of Immanuel Kant had generally caught up to the culture. And so while they were saying we really don't have answers, they were still confronted with the need to act. They were still confronted with the need to act. They still possessed this emotional commitment, if you will, to altruism. And so what she's talking about is where that comes from philosophically, and how that has produced, in effect, the intellectual and cultural bankruptcy that was clearly observable by the middle of the 20th century.
And she also describes that there is an atmosphere, an environment of, she calls it boredom, but at the same time, despair. Like we know that we're going to the cliff, but instead of swimming and trying to get to any part of to grab a rock to survive, we just swim. We just how do you call it in English? Like that position, like not doing anything, but let you go through the cliff.
Yes.
And
well, yeah.
Why?
Well, human beings can argue that knowledge is impossible. Of course, they're asserting knowledge in the process, aren't they? And when they say there are no absolutes, they typically pound their fist. There are no absolutes. And whenever they say, well, knowledge is impossible, morality is just a myth, values and rights are just a myth, that doesn't stop them from the need to act. It emotionally doesn't stop the human from having passions. So they are passionate. They do need to act. They're still committed to a certain policy, if you will, and it's that policy that they want to defend regardless of reason. So as you attack the basic faculty of reason, which philosophy had been doing since Kant, saying there are no answers, you will not find them there. Truth is subjective from one person to another. That did not obviate the need to have action, nor did it obviate their emotional commitment to altruism, which by this point, just like the religious commitment to God, was not a rational one, but an emotional commitment. So just as conservatives are emotionally committed to God, even after the arguments of Hume and modern science have demolished the ideologically, the same is true with altruism and collectivism. They're committed to it, in effect, emotionally committed to it, in effect, without a rational argument. So all you end up doing when you undermine reason is you don't take away the emotional commitments people have, you just make them thoroughly irrational. That doesn't alter our need to act in the face of crisis, it stresses the need to have a rational philosophical answer. All they're doing is saying, no, we're just going to go by the seat of our pants, an irrational, neo-mystical approach. So that's what creates this strange tension. Ayn Rand has an amazing quote here. And of course, obviously, you have to be a brilliant writer to be able to summarize the culture as brilliantly as Ayn Rand does here. But she notices that what we're seeing today is the grotesque spectacle of such attributes as militant uncertainty, crusading cynicism, dogmatic agnosticism, boastful self-abasement, and self-righteous depravity. The two absolutes in today's non-absolutes are that ignorance consists of claiming knowledge and that immorality consists of pronouncing moral judgments. Now, what a brilliant summary of the intellectual and moral state of her time. It was anyone who stood up with moral clarity who was denounced morally. It was anyone who claimed philosophical knowledge or certainty, moral knowledge in particular, or political knowledge, and that, of course, has its roots in epistemology. They were claimed the most ignorant. There's no way out of this trap. It's a Chinese finger trap that is impossible to escape from.
And why? She says that this is not completely honest from their part, in the sense that if they had been honest and saying, well, we tried to seek for answers, but we didn't find any, they would have retreated and said, okay, there are no answers. But instead, they pounding upon pounding, saying that no answers are possible. What is her explanation, and what are they rationalizing with this kind of attitude?
You know, when I study something, whatever the thing I study, and I can't find the answer yet, it could be I just don't have the data yet. It could be I haven't thought it through yet. But if I'm really at the end of my rope mentally, it's a sense of resignation that I have. It's not a crusading desire to act on my ignorance. It's a wait. I better think about it, and I can't be certain of my action until I've thought this through. It's not an honest resignation at all. It's still a demand for action. It's still a passionate demand for certain behavior and certain moral evaluations in a world in which moral evaluations have all been held to be utterly subjective, purely emotional, or the province of mystical religion.
Could you comment a bit more on something that may be different in today's intellectual realm than in the 1960s? My impression is that in the 1960s, there was this wave of tolerance of you can say whatever you want, we won't tell you anything. But my impression is that that attitude has shifted towards this, oh, we won't tolerate anything because you're white and Christian and whatever. Do you think that that is true? And what is the significance about that?
I do think that is true. In the 1960s, the left, even the left, was far more open about civil rights, free speech, differences of opinion, do your own thing, say, be an individualist. Part of the hippie movement was doing your own thing, you know, being yourself. And that required a degree of personal freedom. What is disturbing, and I agree with you, what's disturbing is that personal freedom is, even civil rights and free speech are coming under attack by the left. The old liberal values have been displaced. But if you think about it philosophically, as Ayn Rand would, there are really two sides of the same coin. If I were to say to you that there's no rational ethics and that it all comes down to human feelings, it's subjective, well, that again doesn't obviate the need to act, does it? Nor does it change human psychology and their actual passions. All it does is give sanction to irrational solutions. And that's part of the motive. Or if you view religion as some mystical absolute, an intrinsic absolute like Kant or the religious people, it's sort of built-in, good and bad are built-in intrinsic features to the world, then why not force people? The same is true with subjectivism. Either intrinsicism or subjectivism, a religious approach or a universally skeptical approach to ethics, will necessarily result in force. It sort of necessitates force. It's not as though the good is the chosen anymore. the good, it can be imposed. My feelings versus your feelings, then it's just a question of, whose gang is bigger or who's got the bigger clubs. Or if intrinsicism is correct, well, then these are the commands of God or Kant's commands from the noumenal world or something, and therefore they can be imposed on people. You can do good by forcing people into it. So it obscures the relationship between faith and force, one of the primary themes of her discussion here. But really, it's just the ugly other side of the same subjectivist coin. I could tolerate anything on one side, no matter how far it goes. But of course, the ugly side of that is, well, at some point, my feelings have to be imposed despite other people's feelings, because it's just a matter of feelings.
Yeah, it does. And maybe I would like to pitch this again at the end, because I think we can even apply this tone of the culture into objectivist waves. But I would like first to discuss about the relationship between mysticism, collectivism, and altruism. How have they worked in the past? And why, even though the first two have already been refuted in reality, they still are discussed and treated as such? What is happening there?
Well, Ayn Rand observes a very important historical fact about Western civilization. Since the Renaissance, now, of course, most people were still Christians in the Renaissance, but since the Renaissance, with the introduction of pagan scientific ideas and reason, the ideas of the ancient Greeks were being injected back into Christian culture in the late Middle Ages, and especially the ideas of Aristotle. And these Greek, mostly Aristotelian ideas were having an effect on the mostly religious sensibilities of Christian Europe and displacing them. And you can see it in Renaissance art, cultural developments, world exploration, the religious reformation, the beginnings of the emergence of modern science, artists like Da Vinci and Michelangelo in love with the natural world and their observation of it. And so one could see it would break down and become the age of reason, it would become the age of science, it would become the Enlightenment. And so since the Renaissance, one could see religion as having been in slow retreat, if you will, and reason gaining steam. By the Enlightenment, arguments for God, for example, had been pretty much shattered. So the so-called logical arguments from God of the medievals had been shattered by philosophers like David Hume, and could not be taken seriously anymore. But it continued to persist. Why does religion continue to persist, despite the obvious lack of reason behind religion? You could look at collectivism. We just mentioned earlier, in the middle of the 20th century, collectivist ideas such as communism, fascism, socialism, racism were under severe attack from, everyone knew that there was something wrong here, and there was a sort of crisis in it. No longer was the Soviet Union some noble experiment. And, as the 50s and 60s and 70s wore on, even socialism, democratic socialism in places like Great Britain, was coming to be recognized as a terrible solution and not working out. And this crisis in collectivism, again, provided all kinds of empirical evidence that that was wrong. But again, that didn't cause people to go back and say, hey, let's question collectivism. In both cases, what the intellectuals are trying to preserve as sort of an emotional commitment is the ethics of altruism. The ethics of altruism and self-sacrifice. It's that ethics which is the necessary basis for collectivism. If people are going to have their personal interests squashed by the state for the interest of some greater good or some future of tomorrow, right? They need these collectivist alternatives to be based on a doctrine of self-sacrifice. And as Ayn Rand has long observed, there has never been a rational justification for altruism. Altruism's justifications inevitably, necessarily rest on some form of mysticism, whether it's religious mysticism or a more secularized version of mysticism, like communism's polylogism or something, right? And so altruism necessarily rests on irrationality, and it's the policy implications that these people are emotionally committed to, often whether on the right or the left. But it's an altruism that they don't want to question.
And given that, could you expand a little bit more on what altruism means, in the sense of many people who might be hearing these videos might not be fully aware of Ayn Rand's literature?
Yeah.
What does she mean by that?
Yes, she does not mean benevolence, goodwill to humanity, generosity towards others, helping your friends, helping other people when appropriate. She does not mean benevolence. She does not mean kindness. Those in fact are values that altruism makes impossible, as she points out in this essay. No, 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 no. Altruism, otherism, literally is its etymological root there, is the doctrine of self-sacrifice, not doing all the effort or paying the appropriate price for a high value. It's not doing the enormous effort sometimes that a great value needs to be achieved. No, 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 no. It's not, if you will, paying the appropriate price in cause and effect terms. No, no. And that is often confused with altruism. It's this doctrine that an individual has no right to live for his or her own sake. It's the doctrine that people have to give up, sacrifice, die if necessary, against their own interests. And that is, of course, the necessary moral framework for dictatorship and tyranny. You must be willing to be a pawn, as Hitler. Hitler was perhaps the clearest about this. The individual must sacrifice his or her interests for the good of the Aryan race or for the German fatherland. And that's what they're doing. They're literally sacrificing themselves as individuals completely for that. Or communism said the same basic thing in a more elaborate and indirect way. The individual must sacrifice for the future, for this impossible to achieve future in which everyone will be an Einstein and a Shakespeare in Marx's view, and the state will somehow magically wither away after a dictatorship of the proletariat. So in both cases, what you have is, if you will, a mystical commitment to collectivist solutions that requires a doctrine, a moral doctrine of self-sacrifice. And it is important to distinguish, in Ayn Rand's view, she uses words like altruism and selfishness in a very specific way. What most people think of as selfishness is not what she thinks. Most people aren't even aware, don't even give thought to what's in their actual long-term self-interest. To say that someone is selfish in her view is a great compliment, and it is certainly not being a criminal or a parasite, right? It is being a rational, productive person with independence and integrity in her view. That's the only way to really be selfish. Similarly, altruism is not kindness or benevolence at all. In fact, it necessitates the opposite. It necessitates squashing the individual. It necessitates sacrifice, often on the scale of tens of millions of people being starved or slaughtered.
Could you comment on what is the relationship between altruism and mysticism? And also, she has a quote on the idea of altruism as being always dead and becoming as a vampire, because it sucks the life of people in the same way that vampires suck the blood of people that are alive.
Oh yeah, this triad of mysticism, altruism, and collectivism has been in existence since the Attilas and the witch doctors made their primordial alliance millennia ago. In order for the king to control his population, to put it on the simplest level, he cannot repair to reason or fact. His absolute rule cannot be justified in reason. To control people through morality, to control people through law in the altruist collectivist way that rulers have always wanted to control people, you need mysticism. There needs to be this alliance between the dictator and the witch doctor, as Ayn Rand points out, the mystic. And the mystic was there to provide, religion was there. If you read my book, Creating Christ, it provides a specific example of how Christian altruism, how the doctrine of self-sacrifice in Christianity was in effect a form of political submission, motivated by political submission. Ayn Rand observes repeatedly that where there's someone demanding, an ethicist, a philosopher over here demanding self-sacrifice, there is over here someone, usually a politician, collecting, or just in an ethical sense, someone demanding, collecting those sacrifices. And that's really what it's all about. Altruism must be grounded on irrationality. It can only be grounded in irrationality because its motive is not reality, but its motive is to control and rule people. Power here on earth.
Could you also comment on the on on a comment that is probably falsely attributed to Voltaire, the idea that those who can make you believe in absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And it's also related to some comments that I've gotten historically about the idea of why these people who believe in the word of Jesus were able to commit atrocities such as the Inquisition or the Crusades, etc., etc.
Yes, you can read high and low in either Plato, Plato's Republic, or in the New Testament, or the Old Testament, the whole of the Christian Bible, and you won't find any doctrine of individual rights. You won't find any doctrine of free speech or freedom of religion. In fact, they endorse slavery outright. They endorse totalitarian government outright. You're to obey the government as God's appointed agents on earth. Louis XIV, argued the absolute right of kings, l'état c'est moi. He cited Romans 13 from the New Testament, which basically gives a green light to government absolutism. There's really little question about that. The relationship between altruism and slavery is really fundamental. And it's necessary. It's the necessary moral justification for all of the slavery that people need to keep if they want to keep their commitment to collectivism, to in effect dictatorship. Now, the intimate relationship has been inescapable. Christianity, of course, would be willing to burn people at the stake, torture other Christians for merely having a deviant form of Christian belief. And since the immortal soul is really the most important thing, a little pain here on earth is nothing if we can save their immortal soul, right? So for century after century after century, for the vast majority of the history of Christian rule over the West, they would kill and torture in the name of Christian love.
Let me make a bit of advertisement. Rassi is organizing also these essay discussions on life lately. And the latest one that we discussed was the Objectivist, what is capitalism? And if people in the audience want to know a bit more about this argument and why a view that the good is out there without any reference to men will ultimately lead to force. That's one of the core topics in that essay.
Yes, excellent discussion.
So let me plug in some super chats, and we have 2 so far. Thank you very much, Robert and Marvin. And the first one is Robert making a comment. He says, "Thank you for the discussions. These early essays seem to be so basic until you get back into them. So many powerful identifications and insights."
Very much so. Some of Ayn Rand's classic insights are here. The misunderstandings about capitalism that you just raised there. Today, people look at, the semi-fascist governments, corporatism, and, what they call crony capitalism, was really crony socialism, right? This medieval, and that's what it was, this medieval alliance between monopolies given the crown or the state authority to act. We're regressing into that, and that's still being called capitalism. This horrible mixed economy, which isn't capitalism at all. Ayn Rand understood that capitalism was an unknown ideal, and that it was the system of individual rights the system of individual freedom that capitalism represents. That is how it has to be understood. So much of what capitalism gets the blame for is really just its opposite.
The second super chat is from Marvin, and he asks, what is the connection between faith and prayer? Is prayer required for strong faith to keep the mind irrational by repetition?
I don't know if prayer is necessary to maintain mysticism or irrationality, but let me put it this way. In the absence of reason, people are going to rely upon things like their own little mental rituals, their own little substitutes for rational thought. And there are 1,000 of them. There are 1,000 of them. Quaint little rationalizations provided by some really awful philosophers over the centuries, as I might add. I mean, David Hume, a great critic of religion, told us that you can't derive an ought from an is, right? And so that is, talk about, you think you're hitting religion. Talk about giving religion a lease on life in one sense. Morality is not the province of reason. So if you want to maintain morality, which is a thing that you need here in reality, no God in the real world, here on earth, in a secular sense, we need morality. But if that's the case, if reason can't decide issues of morality, of good and bad, then all we have left is mysticism. All we have left is a mystical answer. An answer we still need in reality, though. So you've got the secular thinkers over here saying, no, morality is impossible on a rational basis, and you've got the religious people saying, right, morality is impossible on a rational basis, so let's go with religion.
Also,
it may be prayer, but some kind of mental ritual to substitute for reason will inevitably be involved.
And in Art and Cognition, one essay that we discussed a couple of weeks ago, she mentions this idea of the mantra. She doesn't call it them mantras, but this idea of repetitive sounds that make you push your consciousness away from the self. Maybe that could also be another interesting thing to connect it with.
Emotional experience is necessary. Emotional experience is necessary. And it'll get them in touch with their sense of life, their metaphysical values, if you will, in a concrete, emotional way while bypassing reason. I have nothing against, and Ayn Rand had nothing against art and symbolism and that sort of, emotional need. In fact, that's what she understood art to be, is our psychological need to see our abstract values concretized so that we can experience them emotionally, experience them perceptually, as if they were perceptual, our highest metaphysical abstractions. So it's not as though we don't need these emotional experiences, it's just that these emotional experiences will serve as a substitute when reason is chucked out.
I want to move to Kant, but first, I think it would be better for us if we follow a little bit of the pattern of the essay and just make a quick distinction between what is reason according to Rand's view and what is not, and also what is mysticism according to her view and what is not.
Right. Well, for Ayn Rand, to know is not a magical thing, right? If an idea pops into my head, that does not, ghost, unicorn, God, that does not oblige reality to contain ghosts, unicorns, and gods in it, does it? I have to connect my ideas to reality by a process of demonstration, a process of logical proof. And see, I know how my senses causally connect me to reality, and I know how logic keeps me connected to reality by means of consistency. And so the only actual causal means of knowing is reason. Ayn Rand defines reason as the faculty that identifies and integrates the material provided by your senses. So it is the conceptual and logical processing of sense perception, which are the only bases of human knowledge, the only real causal bases of human knowledge that people have. Mysticism, in contrast, according to Ayn Rand, is any claim to a non-rational or anti-rational means of acquiring belief. So, Ouija boards, astrological horoscope charts, tea leaf reading, crystal balls, thousands and thousands of alternative mystical experience, just an emotional mystical experience, which is really what it all ultimately comes down to, is an emotional commitment that bypasses reason. So any and this includes a lot of people who think that they're secular, for example. Take Marxism. Marxism thoroughly rejects reason. It claims to be scientific socialism. It claims to embrace technology and, the future, and that they're progressive and all that. This is science in his mind. But of course, he advocates polylogism. The mere fact that, Karl Marx came from a middle class environment might suggest that Marxism is bourgeois logic by his own logic, which is a contradiction in terms. But the fact is that it's not confined to the traditionally religious. I mean, God is the state is God, said Trotsky. They were perfectly happy to substitute the Eastern Orthodox religion of Russia with the Marxist religion of Marxist-Leninism. So by mysticism, Ayn Rand incorporates any non-rational claim to means of knowing.
What about the Socratic method? Wouldn't that kind of view of learning be against reason? I mean, the idea that we already have ideas in our mind and we just have to be like scratched so that they come into surface.
I distinguish two things there. I think that Socrates was a hero when I look back on it, because his dialectical method actually teased out logic. Now, this is before Aristotle systematized the logical fallacies or systematized why it is that certain inferences were valid. So without knowing Aristotelian logic and the grand validation of logic that Aristotle gave it, Socrates was a pioneer. He was a pioneer in developing the methodology of logical analysis. Now, I distinguish that from the Socratic Platonic idea. Plato certainly ascribes to Socrates all of his ideas, and I don't know to what extent, and philosophers are all arguing what's Socrates and what's Plato. What's true, absolutely true, is that Plato, maybe even Socrates, believed that knowledge was not a question of looking at the world. Aristotle said, to know you got to look. And Plato said, no. Knowledge is an effect, an act of recollection. All we have to do is introspect, look into our mind, and then suddenly knowledge of the world will spill out. There may be, it's certainly true, that we have implicit knowledge that we have developed, but Socrates didn't understand the difference between sort of the development of implicit knowledge in childhood and this active recollection. So he thought it was innate ideas. It was our original contact with this perfect world of forms that we needed simply to be reminded of through a process of abstract mathematical contemplation. And of course, that's totally invalid. That's just a form of mysticism.
So let's move to Kant. And could you, Rand calls Kant the main culprit of today's culture. Could you comment on why? And could you specifically comment on this idea of Kant giving people science, but keeping morality and reality to himself?
Kant's work came at the end of the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, and he was responding to the developments in modern philosophy, particularly David Hume. Right? David Hume, he said, had awakened him from his dogmatic slumbers about the impossibility of knowledge on an empirical basis. And rather than questioning that, he used the full panoply of window dressing from the Enlightenment, if you will, the form of rational argument, if you will, from the Enlightenment, absorbing and adopting, if you will, the ideas of modern philosophy, claiming it was consistent with modern science. But at the end of the day, he was simply giving an elaborate explanation for how it is we can't really know things in themselves, how reason really doesn't work, disguised as a defense of reason, in effect, a higher reason, a higher contact with the noumenal world is what's required, even to know that there's a noumenal world. And of course, philosophers immediately ask. But Kant himself, to back up and stay on Kant here before we go to his effect, Kant himself was not in his core an Enlightenment thinker, a secular thinker, a scientific thinker. He was defending the Christian sensibility, the Christian worldview, and he said as much. He had to deny reason in order to make room for faith. He had to defend the Christian ethical sensibility of duty and sacrifice and the abstract quality of intention in morality over reality. And so, in effect, what Kant was doing was he was saving the worst ideas of Christian mysticism, the worst ideas of Christian self-sacrifice, and giving it this Enlightenment window dressing, this Enlightenment veneer, that in order to be serious, intellectual, scientific, you have to abandon reason and embrace this notion of moral duty. Well, philosophy was never the same after Kant. They were all, in effect, reactions to Kant after that. Hegel, for example, would say, well, wait, if we can't know the noumenal world, chuck the noumenal world. It's all just intersubjectivity and getting our ideas coherent within themselves. And he could, with his subjectivism, call for outright dictatorship and collectivism without any of the Enlightenment veneer of political liberalism that Kant still had. And it got worse from there. It got worse from there as all these neo-collectivist ideas like Marx's or the ones that led to Hitler got underway.
What about today's main fad, like the idea of everyone has their superstructures according to the race or the way that they were brought up, but there is no reality, and
isn't that exactly? I just had an argument today with someone. I was talking about parenting and the internet because of Facebook's effect on young women, and that sort of thing. And I said, well, I raised the issue of, well, what's good parenting? And the woman said, well, are you a parent, Mr. Valliant? No, I'm not. My sister's got 5 kids and grandkids, but I don't have kids. I never, my wife and I never wanted them. So she said, you are unqualified to even discuss the issue of Facebook's effect on children because you don't have children, in effect, was the implication. Well, what is that? That's saying that the human mind cannot absorb something that it hasn't experienced. Well, we could never have gotten to the moon that way. No one had experienced going to the moon until we did that. We can actually foresee things. And people can abstractly understand things. And you don't need to be a particular... Now, do I understand that something like abortion affects women in a way that doesn't affect men? Yeah, and that has to be understood. And the way some men approach it act as if they don't grasp that simple fact. But on the other hand, men can still... I'm a man, and I'm about as ferocious an advocate of legalized abortion as I know. It's possible.
And what are the effects of Kant's influence in the culture? Could you comment specifically on this idea that he was even more radical than Christianity, in the sense of Christians? Rand says something like, well, Christians were allowed to love themselves as their neighbor, but with Kant, they aren't even able to do so.
Oh yeah, there's really, the real motivation for Christianity, in effect, is ultimately an egoistic or selfish one, isn't it? You're saving your own soul. Your soul is on the line. Now, you may have to give up sex and money and whip your back bloody like the medieval flagellants. So you may have to, in this world, completely sacrifice yourself. And I mean, completely even martyr yourself. Martyrs were praised in Christianity. So despite all of this worldly self, you have to really sacrifice your earthly life. There's still an egoistic, selfish argument about the next life that's psychologically meant to motivate and manipulate you. Like you point out, even the doctrine, love your neighbor as you love yourself, suggests that at some level you love yourself, right? And Kant was worse than that. Kant severed any connection between human life and morality. And this is what Ayn Rand really objected to, is what's called, fancy, 2-bit name philosophers give it, deontological ethics. It says consequences don't matter at all. At all. We have to evaluate ethics in an intrinsicist sort of sense. In Kant's worldview, does a moral proposition meet the requirements, the abstract requirements of a moral proposition? Is it universalizable, for example? Things like that. And if you met these abstract requirements, then it was your duty, and you have to act on this morality irrespective of your personal interest. So for Kant, he would give the classic example. If your house is burning down and you care to save your children from the burning house, that's of no moral significance, because you do that anyway out of self-interest and inclination. On the other hand, if you ran in to save the neighbor's kids, right, risking your life and leaving your kids to die, well, now that's a moral behavior. That's a completely disinterested. It was just the most vicious form of self-sacrifice was being advocated by Kant. Worse, in effect, than Christianity, because he doesn't even lay out some otherworldly reward you get. Virtue is its own reward, says Kant. And that bromide has penetrated everywhere, isn't it? Virtue has nothing to do with the real world, according to the intrinsicists. The subjectivists who respond to him, you see how stupid that is? Influenced by Hume, they believe that there is no rational ethics and that values are a matter of feelings. My feelings versus your feelings. Both end up in a war between emotions and clubs, don't they? If you dismiss reason, if reason can't solve any of our, give us any answers or solve any of our questions here, then it's your feelings versus mine, ultimately, or your belief in what's intrinsically good versus mine. And it comes down to who's got the bigger gang or the bigger clubs or guns.
Now, the essay is called Fate and Force, the Destroyers of the Modern World. Could you comment a bit more on what the modern world is, specifically what the 19th century was, and why the intellectuals had a very bad regard for it?
The 19th century is one of the most extraordinarily paradoxical moments in human history. On an anthropological level, something was going on in human history that was unprecedented. The population exploded, and you look at the graph of human population through history, right? And then the Industrial Revolution hits and it starts going up, and then the 19th century, it flies up. And not only human population, but the actual well-being of the ordinary person. By the end of the 19th century, the ordinary middle class, working class person in Great Britain or the United States lived infinitely better than Louis XIV could have ever imagined. Higher quality clothes, higher quality and variety in entertainment, food, medicine, you name it. More luxury time. The amount of luxury time that people were having because of increased productivity allowed the expansion of arts. So there was economics, technology, freedom was liberating the human mind in an extraordinary way, and human well-being and human population was growing in a way it had never before done. This was also the period in which humans eliminated in the civilized world the idea that slavery was tolerable. Before the 19th century, it was considered natural or inevitable. By the 19th century, the civilized world, was working to wipe out slavery. It was in this period that suddenly women were seen as the objects of legal abuse in the English and American legal system. And people were thinking about women's rights and individual rights. So much, it was the great revolution in human liberty, the great revolution in human material well-being and prosperity. Europe experienced, from the end of the Napoleonic Wars to World War I, a century of peace, practically unprecedented in all of European history since the fall of the Roman Empire. And so this long period of European peace, there was the Franco-Prussian War, I know, but the Prussians had no problem kicking Napoleon's tail back to France, if you will, which helped lead to World War I, of course. But this extended period of peace in the 19th century. Look at the romantic art. From Beethoven to Tchaikovsky to Rachmaninoff, romantic art, literature, Victor Hugo, and romantic art was exploding across the world. So there was a revolution in the 19th century that people did not recognize, appreciate, or philosophically identify what was going on. In fact, there was a rejection of modernism, a rejection of technology, a rejection of reason, as the ordinary person's life was radically improved, and poverty for the first time, and starvation for the first time was actually being dealt with. Suddenly, the meanness of the industrialists and the smearing of these creative technological geniuses who were risking everything to improve human life, they were the bad guys. What can explain the rise of this irrational romanticism at this very moment? Kant. Kant. And behind that, Kant's motive. Kant's motive. They wanted to keep the primordial ethics of altruism, the religious ethics, in effect, of altruism, even without the old religious metaphysics. So they had to develop their whole new mysticism behind it. Why? Because they were committed to certain collectivist outcomes. And it's altruism that is the key bridge between the two. And that is what people no longer wanted to could not question, because they realized, in effect, that's what had to be questioned at that point. It is the profit. Adam Smith couldn't defend capitalism. To him, it's paradoxical that the selfishness of some people should result in the well-being of other people. Of course, there's no paradox to the objectivist. To defend capitalism, to defend the 19th century, they needed to question altruism. They needed to defend capitalism on the profit motive, on the idea that an individual has the right to live for his own well-being and happiness, to live for his own sake. And that was what was not questioned. And it's this vampire. That's why it's a vampire. It's neither rationally justified, but it's sort of this old dead idea that's kept alive through the course of this as a justification for their collectivist solutions. That is what she's talking about here, this vampire idea of altruism that prevented intellectuals from seeing the glorious revolution that was taking place in the 19th century and early 20th century.
Could you comment if this is only applicable to intellectuals of that time? Because my impression is that people were very fond of the era. They called it the age of progress, and they loved all the things that were coming. For instance, here in Britain, it was Crystal Palace, right, or the expositions, or the art of the era, and many other spectacles that came by. But at the same time, my impression is that that sense of life, if you call it, was maybe some of the reason why ideologies such as socialism could get inside people's psyches so quickly, because they said, well, everything's going so well that maybe we could just make a little tweak to this thing that it's going on.
Exactly. And that same kind of mystical, fallacious logic can still be seen today. There are people who think that artificial intelligence and computers will make any physical effort, any even intellectual effort, no longer necessary in the future. In fact, it will change the economy such that we'll have unlimited supply. It's sort of a Marxist, mystical dream about what the future will be, right? And you still have that same kind of logic, as if science itself will continue to go on whether people are free or not. And so you have, well, take, for example, you can see it classically in George Orwell in 1984. He imagines that a total dictatorship could maintain for, centuries, decades, a high-tech civilization. When you contrast that, say, with Ayn Rand's dystopia, written more than 10 years earlier and published in England, by the way, she also created a future dictatorship dystopia in which language itself was being corrupted. Very similar in that sense to Orwell, only she realized that after a century or so of that, people would be quickly back to the Dark Ages, and the candle would be a big innovation. See, it's the relationship between faith and force and reason and freedom. Ayn Rand understood that to operate reason, the basic faculty of human knowledge, our only way of knowing, our most basic tool of survival, therefore, our most basic means of life and death. For it to operate, people have to be free. People have to be free to disagree. People have to be free to act on their own judgment. If you don't do that, then you've deactivated reason. If I point a gun at a group of people, whether I'm a criminal or the government, suddenly my thinking, my judgment is all that matters. They have to take orders, and all of those minds are shut down. The force destroys the operative effect of reason, making it impossible to enact. Literally, force and mind are opposites. Force and mind are opposites. And that is an essential point that must be obfuscated by your contemporary collectivist. They have to be able to imagine a world in which we can continue to have scientific and cultural progress at the point of a gun. But that just can't happen. And so that is why censorship destroys a culture's vibrancy. That is why cultural freedom and a lack of censorship results in a vibrant culture. That is why, in the economic sense, economic freedom results in material prosperity, the application of technology to the physical problems of human survival. Reason requires free. Let me put it this way. Freedom is to reason and progress what oxygen is to fire. And Ayn Rand understood that. The primary social condition for the operation of freedom, or for the operation of reason, is political freedom.
That takes me to the positive side. What is the relationship between, she said that mysticism, force, and altruism are one sole axis, but what is the other axis? And what is it based upon?
The diametrical opposite of each, right? Not mysticism, reason. Reason is the only means of human knowledge. Only means of human knowledge. Egoism, that you have a right to live for your own sake, that every human being is an end in themselves. Each and every individual is a precious, irreplaceable value, an end in itself. That's the true moral opposite of altruism, collectivism. No, the individual has rights. The individual has rights that no one can violate. He has a sphere of freedom that no criminal and no government, no majority, however big. If 9 people, there's 10 people in the room and 9 people vote to beat up the 10th, that doesn't make it okay. That no supermajority can take away these rights of the individual. Individual rights is the opposite of collectivism. Egoism is the opposite, that is to say, a person's right to live for his or her own sake is the opposite of altruism. And they are all based upon reason, a commitment to reality, a commitment to reality. And of course, that's the way it works in history. The Enlightenment produced freedom. The Enlightenment is what gave us the United States of America, despite what the conservatives mouth, and they're completely wrong. The United States was the exact opposite of everything in the Christian Bible. It was the nation of the Enlightenment, as Dr. Peikoff says. It was the product of arguments against slavery and for individual freedom, such as John Locke or Algernon Sidney were giving during the Enlightenment, separating religion and state, creating the secular state for the first time, opening up individual freedom. That was a product of the Enlightenment and rational thought, and can only be justified that way. And
it's crazy how much respecting a little bit reason gives you great results. I mean,
imagine a nation that began like the United States, saying that each individual has the right to pursue his or her own happiness. That is an affront to every dictator that has ever existed. That is what the collectivists don't want. They do not want people to be free to use their own judgment, pursuing their own happiness in their own way, fulfilling their own lives according to their own best judgment. The idea of that as a moral ideal is precisely what every dictator and tyrant in the history of humanity has sought to morally undermine. And for that, they've required their witch doctor at their side.
So I have one last question, and that is, what should we be looking for? Since if we have talked about how faith and force are the destroyers of the modern world, what is for the world if we continue with this altruistic premise in our society? And what is of the world if we challenge that? and introduce objectivism to our lives.
It is altruism that must be challenged. And to do that, we have to defend reason. And so I have to say philosophy is the answer. The answers here are there. And we have to first say that they are possible, and reason is really the most fundamental issue. And I would put right after that displacing the evil doctrine of Christian altruism and Kantian altruism. That's the root of the problem here is altruism. Submit to the evildoer, love your enemy, turn the other cheek. That is sanctioning of evil. It is not, I said the other day, it's not pacifists will say to us, by responding with reasonable self-defense, we're sinking to the level of the violent person. No, we're not. It's the pacifist who's sinking to the level of the violent person, sanctioning it and encouraging it. And so altruism necessarily leads to these collectivist consequences. So it's the putting it all together that we need to do with philosophy. We need to defend reason, so that we can defend the right of an individual to live his or her own life, and that implies the end of political tyranny as such. Philosophy is the answer.
I agree. And thank you very much, James. I don't know if you have something else to say about this essay.
I'll just end by saying that after I finished Ayn Rand's fiction, this was the very first nonfiction of Ayn Rand's that I ever, not only was it early in her career, it was the first nonfiction of hers I ever read. And it was the perfect introduction. So for people who are unfamiliar, may have read a couple of her novels and are unfamiliar with her nonfiction work, Faith and Force, Destroyers of the Modern World is maybe the best single introduction to her nonfiction because it covers, the basics so well.
Thank you. And I think it's maybe the first thing that I read of Rand, basically because I was really interested in her critique to Kant, which was the first thing that I learned about her. And the quotes that you see in Kant here, about Kant here, is one of the few things that I started reading about her. And I love them. Well, with that being said, thank you very much, James. And thank you very much, Robert and Marvin. And to all the audience, I appreciate very much this kind of discussions. Please consider giving more super chats next time, and also becoming a member of the Ayn Rand Center UK. There are a lot of perks,
this month we're going to be celebrating Leonard Peikoff's birthday, so there are going to be a lot of events focused around that, we hope. And of course, this Saturday I continue with the group. You can really participate. We have a great interactive discussion on Saturdays where we cover Leonard Peikoff courses about Ayn Rand's philosophy. We're in the midst of one now, but we'll shortly start another one. So there's lots of perks in being a subscriber, so please subscribe.
I agree. Thank you. So, well, thank you very much, James, again, and see you next week.
Yeah, take care, Alejandro.
Bye.